In this chapter, we're going to take a deep dive into the document object model. The document object model is looking at our document, which is our HTML page, and treating it like an object, and it's going to be an object that contains other objects. So you need to know that the document object is built as your web page loads, and then your browser will have the document object that you can access. So let's take a look at a web page, and we can kind of see how the document object is arranged here. So here's the code for a basic web page. We have our doc type, we have an HTML and an ending HTML, and inside that we have a head section. Inside the head section there's a title. We have a body, and inside the body there's an H1. There's a form, and inside that form, between the beginning and closing tags, we have some labels and an input, and it looks like a span. So this document, as it's loaded into the web browser generates the document object. And it's a model of the page. So here's our HTML, and inside our HTML at the first level, we have a head and body section. Go back here. HTML contains the head section and the body section. Okay. Inside the head section, there's a title section, and the title has some text inside of it. Okay. Each one of these things is called a node. The element nodes are represented by the ovals in this diagram. The document object model includes text nodes that hold the text for whatever those things contain. And there's also attribute nodes, but the attribute nodes, we're simplifying a little bit, and we're not showing those right now in this particular diagram. So if we look, the body contains an H1 and a form. The form contains a label, an input, and a span, and each one of these things has some kind of text inside of them, and we can see those nodes. So we need to kind of understand how this object is laid out in this. It's basically a tree. And how can we get to each of these elements so that we can manipulate the things on our web page? Okay. So we have the document object, we have our elements, we have attributes, which we didn't show in this diagram. I told you that. And then we have text nodes. Okay, so these are all nodes that we can access. Some of the properties of the node interface. We can talk about parent and child nodes. So let's go back. So the form is the parent node for the label, input, and span. The span, the label, and the input are the children of the form. So we can talk about this parent-child relationship. The body has an H1 and a form child. The form has the label, input, and span children. Those will come in handy for us. We can talk about the first child and the last child. So under the form, we have a label, input, span. Label would be the first child. Span would be the last child. Okay. And then we can talk about siblings. Next element sibling. Next element sibling. If I'm talking about the label, its next sibling element would be the input. Okay, so the children are related to each other. They are siblings. And we have the first child, the last child, and so on and so forth. And we'll see examples of how to use these later. So a lot of this comes, understanding of this comes down to that whole parent-child relationship. We also have the node value. The value for a text, comment, or attribute node, it returns the text that's stored in the node. If there's no text inside the node value would return null. And then for a text, comment, or attribute nodes, we can have text content that's inside, any text that's inside the node or any of its descendant nodes would be the text content. So these are properties that we can have of nodes. Nodes can have all these different properties. So let's take a look at this. Look at an example here. Here we have a span, opening tag and ending tag. Inside the span, we have some tags that are really deprecated and we shouldn't be using anymore, but we're going to use them for this example apparently. So we have welcome, which is inside a bold tag. And you probably know we should be using strong and not bold anymore. But here's our bold tag, and welcome is in bold. We have an underline tag. And the underline is around the word back. So we have welcome in bold, back is underline. And then we have italics around the exclamation point. So the span is a parent node, the bold is a child node, the U is a child node, and the italics is a child node. So let's look at how we can manipulate this little line of HTML using the document object model. So we're going to do a document query selector, and we're going to get the span, and that's going to return this. And we're going to use this span, and we'll see that in the next slide. So right here, we're going to look for the B element. That's the element that was bolded, right? So we're going to try and pull that out of our web page. So we look at span, and if you remember back here, span is the variable we used when we did a query selector for the span tag. Okay, so we're going to span, and we're going to say span, we want the first child, and we want its first child's node value. Okay, so let's go back here. Span's first child is bold. There's a text node, and then we're going to get the value out of that text node. So we just pulled out the word welcome using those properties. Got the first child. We got that first child's first child, so we kind of chained them together here. So the first child of the B is the text node, and then we took the node value from that text node. That seems a little complicated. We're going to learn better ways to do this as we go, but you need to kind of understand the logic of these using these child nodes. So let's get the underline element. So we're going to look at the first child. That's our bold. That was our bold child in there. And then we're going to get its next element sibling. And that was the underline. Okay, so now we're into this node. Okay. And then we're going to get its first child, which is the text node that's contained inside that bold. And then we're going to get the value out of there, which is the word back. And then for the I element, we're going to pull the last child and take its first child, which is its text content, and get its node value. And then they're logging out to the console. Let's log out the B element, the U element, and the I element, and it's just going to display welcome back, except it's going to display it just in text. We won't have any of the formatting anymore. We managed to pull all those text out. That's kind of a long way around getting each individual item from all those child elements. There's also, if we just wanted those words, we could also do something like this. We could declare a variable called span text, and we could take that span and just get its .text content property, and it pulls all the text without anything else in it out of there, and we can display it that way. So this is kind of a long way to do what we could do with this, but sometimes we might need to do things this way. All right, we can also use those elements to set things. So we were getting information out of the document object model. We can also change the document object model by using these. So let's set our span. Let's set that first child's text content to equal hurry. So we can actually change the text content of one of those children. And now, instead of welcome back, it says hurry back. Let's set the text of the span element. So span text content. So we're taking the entire span and changing all of its text content to just say hi. And that replaces all the child node elements within that span. So we had those three child elements. Now we just have one child element, which is just a text node. So we can actually set the items on a web page using these parent and child and text content nodes. Some common methods of the document and element interfaces. We've seen this one many, many, many times. We can use the query selector, and we provide it with a selector. Now, what kind of selectors can we use in there? We can use an ID. We can use a class name. We can use any kind of selector that we want to query for a certain item on a web page. We can also do a query selector all. So if I did a query selector all and used an A in here, it would get me all the anchor tags off of a page and store them in an array. We also have some methods we can test to see if an element has an attribute of a certain name, and if it does, it will be true. We can get attribute, which returns the value of an attribute specified in the name. So whatever we pass in here, it returns the value. Or if the attribute for that element is not set, it'll return an empty string. The set attribute with a name and value sets the attribute specified in the name, so we can call set attribute, specify the name of the attribute we want to set and the value we want to set it to. And we can also remove an attribute from an element just by specifying it. So here's an example that I just mentioned a minute ago. We're going to look at the document, and we're going to do a query selector all, and we're going to get all of the anchor tags, all the A tags, all the hyperlinks, and we're going to store it in this constant called links. Here's another example, HTML unordered list element. So we have an unordered list. It has an ID of image_list, and it has a couple list items. It looks like a picture of a lion and a picture of a tiger, and here's the end. So if we want to get a list, an array that holds all the list item elements, we can do something like this. Query the document.query selector. We're going to pull out the image list, which pulls out the entire list. Okay. And then we're going to query that list. We're going to do list.query selector all and pull out all the list items and store those in an array called items. Here's another example, how to test for and get an attribute. So we can take that list and say, does that list have an attribute class? Does it have a class applied to it? So we know what a class is. It's some CSS formatting, and we can check to see if there's a class applied. And we can get the attribute of that class too and store it in a variable or in a constant if we want to. We can also set an attribute. For instance, we can set the class to open. So we have a class set up in our CSS called open, and we can say, hey, get that list, set its class attribute. Let's set it to open. And we can also remove a class attribute if we want. So if this list had an attribute applied as a class, we could remove it, so it wouldn't have any classes applied to it anymore. All right, so what we've seen so far in this chapter is properties and methods that are part of the document object model core specification. In the next video, we're going to keep looking at the document object model, but we're going to look at the document object model HTML specification. So there's two kind of ways to look at this, and we've looked at the core specification, and in the next video, we'll look at the HTML specification for the document object model.